Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something that, well, might seem like nothing much at all. Silence.
Right, but what our sources are showing is that silence is really, it's far from empty.
Exactly. We're going to explore the, I guess, surprising power and the different ways silence works and voice, too, and the sort of interesting spaces where they meet.
hmm And our goal here in this deep dive is really to get beyond that simple idea that silence is just, the opposite of speaking.
Yeah.
We want to understand how they actively work together, especially when you think about things like power, resistance, and just, well, people's different experiences all over the world.
And the main source we're drawing on is this really fascinating chapter exploring the power of silence, voice, and the in-between in a troubled world by Jane L. Parpart.
Yeah, it brings together so many different angles.
It really does. Different studies, different viewpoints.
Sure.
It's definitely made me think differently about it all. Okay, so let's unpack this. When you first think of silence, what probably comes to mind is just no sound, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe even that someone feels powerless, like they can't speak up.
That's definitely the common take.
Yeah.
But one of the really key ideas in the material is that silence isn't just a void. It can be, and this is the phrase used, a co-constituted embodied practice and political act.
Okay, what does that mean in, like, plain terms?
Well, think of it like this.
Yeah.
Our bodies, our actions, including choosing not to speak, they actively create the meaning of that silence in that specific moment, that context.
Nah.
So,
Okay.
for instance, imagine a community choosing not to vote in an election they see as rigged. That collective silence, that's a political statement. It carries weight.
Right, right. And here's where it gets, I think, really interesting. The chapter talks about these liminal in-between spaces, places where silence and voice aren't really separate things, but they're actually interacting.
Mm,
It's kind of like the pause between notes in music. It's not just emptiness. It's where the sound hangs, and it prepares you for what's next.
that's a great analogy.
And these in-between spaces with silence and voice, that's where reflection can happen. Maybe where new strategies get worked out, new ideas start to form.
Exactly.
So for you listening, wanting to get a quick but deep understanding, seeing silence as this active space, that could be a really useful way to think about complex situations.
And what's quite fascinating is how personal this can be. The author, Popart, she reflects on her own experiences with Quaker meetings.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And the silence there, it wasn't just about being quiet. It was uh, a really vital way to look inward, to sort of navigate difficult patches, and to get a better sense of when silence was needed and conversely when it was time to speak.
That really makes you reconsider, doesn't it? We often feel we have to fill every quiet moment,
We do.
but maybe there's actual strength in just
Right.
being in that silence. Now, the chapter also gets into the history, specifically the struggle for women to even have their voices heard. We all know that old phrase, women being expected to be seen and not heard. That's been such a barrier for so long.
Oh, absolutely. That historical context is just crucial. I mean, the early feminist movement was fundamentally about shattering that silence, right? Demanding the right to speak out.
Yeah.
And we're still seeing echoes of that struggle, I mean, all around the world. You look at the incredibly courageous women in Iran right now, speaking out publicly, despite huge risks. It just underscores how ongoing that fight for voice is.
But the source material makes a really important distinction here. It quotes Fivish and Pasupathy saying something like, "It is not that silence is bad and voicing is good. Rather, both operate together
Yeah.
in ways that are important for constructing what happened in the past, as well as what that means for our present and future selves."
Right. So it's not that simple, not just one good, one bad.
Exactly. It really forces you to ask, okay, when is speaking out the most powerful thing? And when might choosing silence actually hold a different kind of power?
Yeah.
And looking back at history helps here. Think about, say, the Grimke sisters back in the 19th century.
Society absolutely expected women to stay quiet on public issues, but they spoke out really bravely against slavery.
Despite the pressure.
Totally. And it's interesting, isn't it, that they had that Quaker background we mentioned earlier, which values silence and introspection, even though they ultimately found their public voice, especially after moving to Philadelphia.
That's a fascinating link. And then, of course, there's the whole long, drawn-out fight for women's suffrage in the U.S.
Right.
And even when white women finally got the vote in 1920, black and brown women were often still excluded for years.
Which just powerfully shows how power structures decide who gets a voice and whose silence is, well, effectively enforced.
Yeah.
And if we kind of zoom out from that, we see these aren't just Western issues. The chapter then takes this whole discussion global And it really challenges some assumptions about gender and voice that tend to come from, a Western liberal perspective.
This part really struck me, how some of those early global development projects maybe didn't work out so well because they tried to impose Western ideas about women's roles without really understanding the local dynamics.
Exactly, like assuming empowerment looks the same everywhere, which of course it doesn't. It overlooks the reality on the ground, local cultures, local ideas about masculinity, everything.
So understanding those historical cultural differences is key.
Absolutely crucial. It shapes everything about gender relations and consequently how silence and voice are used and interpreted. Bonnie Ibhawa's work on human rights history in Africa comes up here.
Okay.
He argues for what he calls a counter-hegemonic approach,
Mm.
basically recognizing the complexities, the exclusions within those standard human rights frameworks.
Got it. And it's not just big movements, right? The chapter mentions things like the experiences of female soldiers in Sierra Leone.
Yeah, Megan Mackenzie's work, it adds yet another layer, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Understanding women's agency in these incredibly different, often very dangerous contexts. And to really show how this plays out, how silence and voice interplay in different cultures, the chapter dives into some really interesting case studies,
Okay.
like Wendy Urban Mead's research on the Pietist movement in Zimbabwe, the Brethren in Christ Church.
What did you find?
Well, she found the church meant different things and held different levels of importance for men and women at different times. For women, early on, it could actually be quite liberating, a source of support, whereas men often became more central later on.
Huh. That's quite a contrast.
It is.
Right.
And then you have Keith Basso's anthropological work with the Western Apache, totally different context.
Right.
And he found that using silence wasn't just random quietness. It was deeply tied into social relationships, cultural rules.
So how did they use silence?
Well, what Basso noticed was that silence could be a really deliberate response when there was uncertainty in social situations. Like when people didn't know each other well. It was almost a way to navigate that initial phase carefully. Even in things like courtship, there was this careful dance between silence and speaking.
So it really pushes back against seeing silence as just awkward or, negative.
Exactly. Basso's work shows it's not a blank slate everywhere. The meaning is coded by the culture, by the social situation. It's not always that someone has nothing to say. Sometimes silence is the communication.
Okay. And then there's another study mentioned Saba Mahmoud's work in Egypt, also with the Pietist movement.
Yes, and this one really challenged some common Western feminist ideas about agency.
How so?
Well, Mahmoud argued against the idea that the only way women show agency is by overtly resisting or speaking out against patriarchal structures.
Okay.
She found that women in this movement in Egypt actually gained respect, influence, a kind of power through their religious practices. And that included embracing certain forms of silence, certain forms of submission within those existing structures.
So agency can look very different depending on the context.
Precisely. Power and agency can manifest in really diverse ways. And this connects nicely to Evyatar Zirbovol's idea about listening to the sounds of silence.
Listening to the sounds of silence. I like that.
Yeah. It means paying attention to what isn't being said, because that's often crucial for understanding the real dynamics.
That makes sense. That ability to notice the unsaid seems so important. Okay, so moving towards more contemporary examples. Aliyah Khalid's research in Pakistan.
Fascinating stuff. She found women there were strategically using both silence and voice
For what purpose?
to help their daughters get an education,
Yes.
often in environments where that was really challenging or frowned upon.
So that strategic element again. Silence as a tool, not just passive.
Exactly. But the chapter also touches on situations where silence is perhaps less chosen, more imposed, like the very vulnerable position of cross-border women involved in sex work in South Africa.
Right.
There, silence might be more about the suppression of voice because of legal dangers, social stigma, fear.
A very different dynamic.
Very different. And Saxater's work on violence against women in Colombia is mentioned too, just reminding us of the incredibly harsh realities many women face, where speaking out carries immense risk.
Yeah.
But even in those awful situations, silence can still sometimes be, as the chapter puts it, a coping mechanism for enabling reflection, healing, and rethinking one's position.
So even then, it can serve a purpose, internally at least. It seems silence and voice aren't always opposites then. They can actually work together.
Absolutely, especially in, say, post-colonial contexts.
Mm.
They can be used together for strategizing, for organizing resistance, even for promoting healing after trauma.
And Patricia Collins' work is mentioned.
Yes, looking at how African women have sometimes used silence strategically to sort of consolidate resources, build networks, and strategize against oppression, often under the radar.
Uh-huh. And Audre Lorde, too, right? Her powerful writing often touches on the power of both speaking out and the significance of silence in struggles against oppression.
Precisely. Which leads us really nicely into the idea of collective silence as a form of protest.
Oh, yeah, the chapter gives some really powerful examples of
Yeah,
this.
incredibly powerful.
Like the Argentine madres of the Plaza de Mayo, just thinking about them. Their silent visuals, walking in that circle, holding hands.
And the white headscarves? Originally diapers?
Yes, the symbolism was immense, all done in silence, but shouting volumes.
Exactly. And then there was the South African women's black sash movement.
Right, their silent gatherings, too.
Another potent example of how collective silent presence can demand attention to create solidarity.
And the author, Parpart, shares her own experience being part of a Women in Black vigil in London.
She does. And Cynthia Cockburn's reflections on those vigils are mentioned too, how powerful, even calming, that shared silence could feel amidst turmoil.
It's a very different kind of power, isn't it?
It really is. And maybe one final complex example the chapter uses to show this interplay is Anita Hill's testimony.
Ah, during the Clarence Thomas hearings.
Yes. Her situation really highlights how choices about when to speak, what to say, and crucially, the silences surrounding those moments.
Yeah.
How they're all deeply tangled up with navigating entrenched patriarchal power structures.
Yeah, that was such a complex and revealing moment in terms of both voice and silence.
Definitely.
So, okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, the big takeaway for me seems to be that, gendered power. It's not just about who has the microphone.
Not at all.
Silence itself is this force. It's complex, it communicates, and it's often way more powerful than we tend to think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And really understanding that relationship between silence and voice and those kind of in-between spaces,
Yeah.
it forces us to look globally, doesn't it? And to question our easy assumptions.
Yeah, you can't just apply one model everywhere.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the way silence and voice interact is dynamic, it's always shifting, and it creates all sorts of possibilities in this changing world.
Well said.
So on that note, maybe here's something for you, the listener, to mull over. Building on that idea from Zia Bavel about listening to the sounds of silence. Think about what might be going unsaid in your own life or in the world around you, and what kind of power, what potential might actually be sitting right there in that silence. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.